Today we're going to cover the myth of the benevolent slave master, the benevolent enslaver. And this really comes off of, to give you some background for the reason that I started this channel, I started it about a year ago. I had, antebellum slave laws and slave codes has been my academic area of study, my area of scholarly research. And I had discovered over the last couple of years, I stumbled upon Paleo-Confederate Doug Wilson, Pastor Doug Wilson. And the reason that he's even more important now than ever is that he is Pete Hegseth's pastor, the Secretary of Defense, and he's now back in the news because he's a Christian nationalist. He's in D.C. right now, and apparently he has a lot of clout over Pete Hegseth and other political figures. But he styles himself as a Paleo-Confederate, which he makes a difference from a Neo-Confederate. I don't, but it's all one and the same to me. But he had written a pamphlet. It's only a couple of pages, maybe like 20 or so pages, called Southern Slavery as It Was. So when I decided to start this channel, I made this channel name Southern Slavery Uncovered, kind of as a rebuttal to this Neo-Confederate, Paleo-Confederate, whatever he calls himself, idea that slavery was in fact a benevolent institution, and I'm convinced he believes was good for Africans and people of African descent. He actually wrote in this pamphlet, quote, "Because of its dominantly patriarchal character, it was a relationship based upon mutual affection and confidence. There has never been a multiracial society which has existed with such mutual intimacy and harmony in the history of the world," end quote. Now, besides that he's just bat-poo insane, let's be clear about something. Enslavers, if they were benevolent, if they were nice to their slaves, were not nice to them out of genuine personal kindness. Now, I want to be careful here because as a law professor, as an attorney, I've tried to make this channel stick 100% to the judicial opinions of the antebellum courts in the slaveholding states. But sometimes I do have to give you my opinion, my professional opinion on the evidence that's presented before me. And I hate speaking in absolutes, like no one, everyone, that sort of thing. Were there some enslavers who did things genuinely because they cared? Sure, of course they were. But we have to really look at the motives for why the majority of enslavers did what they did. And also, forgive me, I am going to make a longer video on this topic. I have just been sick recently, that's why I continue to cough, but there have been so many new subscribers to this channel the last couple of days, I wanted to put this out as kind of a primer. I am planning on making longer, better quality, more educational videos on this, but I did just want to dip my toe in the water and explain why, this argument that most slaves were treated well, because I get comments like this all the time on the channel, is a nonsense argument. So let's understand real quick, as we do this quick video today, that the idea of this paternalistic society where the plantation owners, the enslavers believed that, they were this father figure, not over their white family, but over their black enslaved family as well. It grew out of that racial pseudoscience and white supremacy that was the foundation for the antebellum system of African slavery. It taught planters, remember, that slavery was their duty to better and to improve Africans and people of African descent. It was the best place for Africans, and that their condition was bettered by being enslaved to Caucasians. Their own writings, the writings of the planter class, now hilariously, especially after the war and the abolition of slavery, make it clear that they believed that they were this father figure because they express a lot of their, how angry they were about the ingratitude of their former slaves after the abolition of slavery. And we'll talk about that at the end. I want to circle back to that because I think that's important, this idea of gratitude, right? So enslavers first, when we talk about them treating slaves nice, right, or not being so harsh on them, they understood that punishments were a double-edged sword. If you punish a slave too harshly, they could resent being enslaved even more. And also, which we'll talk about in a little bit, many enslaved had families. In fact, planters encouraged families, which again is hilarious because marriage between slaves had no legal function at all. It wasn't recognized by any courts or any states in the antebellum South. But an enslaver, a master, could allow slaves to get married and have a family. They encouraged that because that gave them more control over their enslaved peoples. So if you punish the slave too hard, you not only would you get resentment from him or her, but their families as well. Their families could resent it. So to prevent excessive punishments or to hold back from excessive punishments wasn't an act of benevolence, it was an economic necessity. The whole purpose of this system, while it pretended to be for the betterment of Africans, right? Enslavement is good for them. That's the whole justification for it. The real reason for this is economics and money. And if you had a slave who was disobedient or refusing to do something, and you beat him or her too hard and punish them too harshly, that may bring them back into working for you, or it might kill them, in which case you've now lost your investment. We'll talk about killing slaves in a bit as well, which is a horrible thing. It shows you how evil the system was. But you also ran the risk, if you punish a slave too harshly, of his family now resenting you and deciding to work less, and it becoming more of an economic problem. So they understood this. That was the main drive for many of these enslavers not to brutally torment their enslaved, not because they weren't allowed to do it, which we've talked about at length in many of these videos. They were. In fact, beating a slave to death, as long as that death occurred during a punishment that was meant to bring a slave back into a state of submission, was not murder, was not manslaughter, was not a crime. Arbitrarily killing, maiming, or torturing a slave was considered a crime in all of the slaveholding states. But if that enslaver or if that overseer simply argued that I was doing it and continued to do it because they refused to submit, and it was a reasonable punishment that has been recognized by the state as being reasonable, such as whipping with a bullwhip, and that enslaved person died, then there was no criminal or civil liability to that person who killed that enslaved. So they knew this. But again, doing that might have more of an economic impact than not punishing them as harshly. There was a periodical called the Southern Planter, which was a newspaper for farmers and planters in the antebellum South. And in one edition, it gave advice to white mistresses, like the head of the household, of how to treat your house servants, your enslaved people who worked in the house. And it said, quote, "Never scold when a servant neglects his duty, but always punish him, no matter how mildly, for mild treatment is the best. Severity hardens them." So you see, they were aware. Even the periodicals, the journals that gave advice on how to treat enslaved, understood that excessive punishment, what it could do to an enslaved person, how they could react and become worse than they were before you administered too harsh of a punishment, how the families would react. So it wasn't out of kindness. It was out of economic necessity. But let's be clear, right? The other edge of that sword did exist. As the Louisiana Supreme Court said, unequivocally, quote, "So far as regards the slave, the power of the master is indeed absolute. The slave cannot resist or be heard if he complain of the abuse of this power," end quote. So the master's power was indeed absolute. And as I've said, while the courts did punish, and I'll put references to court cases here as well, did punish the arbitrary or wanton, cruel killing or maiming of an enslaved person, they always left the back door open in those case opinions to say, however, a reasonable punishment that is done to bring a slave back into a state of submission that results in a slave's death is not a crime. And this happened across the antebellum slaveholding states and in all of these jurisdictions, in all of these antebellum Supreme Courts. The Alabama Supreme Court, talking about punishment, recognized enslaved people as moral sentient beings, as humans. And interestingly enough, in one case suggested that a slave's happiness was actually tied to their conformity to, quote, virtue, which, if you read between the lines, what they were implying is this virtue is conformity to a specific set of behaviors that aligned with the interest of the enslaver. So am I doing what my slave owner wants me to do? And that this conformity of the enslaved could, and in fact should, be enforced through corporal punishment, so physical punishment, if you couldn't persuade them to act in a certain way. So if your benevolent method of trying to get your slave to conform and live this virtuous life and do what they're told failed, then the Alabama Supreme Court clearly said you should resort to physical punishment. Now let's look at another thing. Let's look at families. When we talk about benevolent slave owners, let's talk about the families of the enslaved. Next to anger over being punished, the biggest reason given by enslaved people who fled their plantations, enslaved people who ran away for reasons for why they had fled, was their desire to try and find relatives who had been sold to other plantations. Thousands of enslaved ran away to find their wives, their husbands, their children, and their siblings. Slaveholders knew this. And by knowing this, they used families as a tool to get discipline and order out of their enslaved. They understood this. So most enslavers, and I say most because some, of course, did keep families together out of what they thought was the kindness of their own heart, but most enslavers understood that keeping families together was an economic necessity, right? A Dutch slaveholder in 1750 noted, quote, "It is necessary that the Negroes have wives, and you ought to know that nothing attaches them more to a plantation as children," end quote. So allowing slaves to have families, to have children, it wasn't out of kindness. It was this economic motive that kept them tied to that plantation, that increased your property in slaves by them having children, and the threat of selling or separating a family could motivate slave A to do, to fall back in line and do what you told them to do. But also understanding that if you did separate a family, you ran a very high risk of other slaves in that family running away, fleeing the plantation to go find their family members. So it behooved you as an enslaver to keep families together, because if you separated families, many would run away, many would refuse to work, and then it would become an economic disadvantage to you. So it was ammunition. It was a tool. They kept them together not because they were benevolent, but because they knew that if you separated families, it would cause strife, it would cause problems. It would impact the bottom line, money, the economics of the plantation, which was the whole purpose of this. Slaveholders knew that if you sold a disobedient slave away off the plantation, which again many did, that the resentment it caused within that slave's family might turn them from good workers into disobedient themselves. And the slaveholders knew this. All these plantations kept documented records not only of their slaves, but their slave families, and who the master, the enslaver, the plantation owner let slave A marry slave B, and who those children were. So if slave A was disobedient, but his wife and children were very obedient enslaved people doing what you wanted them to do and being an economic benefit to the plantation, then you knew that selling away that husband, that father, would cause the wife and children to do less work, to possibly run off. So it was all economic based. It wasn't out of the kindness of anyone's heart that they were doing this. Any slaveholder that was benevolent was because it was part of the system of controlling people of African descent and these enslaved people. So regardless, enslavers still did tear families apart. And we know this, right? The horrors of selling wives from their husbands and children from their mothers. But let's get back to this idea of the benevolent master and the slaveholder, and this idea of gratitude, right? And I find this very interesting. This is what I'm going to close on today. Again, I'm making a much longer video on this with a lot more information, education. I hope you'll stay tuned for that. I hope you like, subscribe, share, and you become a follower of this channel to learn about the horrors of the antebellum slaveocracy. But what I always found interesting was after the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment, when slavery ended, a lot of former slaves stayed around their former masters, their former enslavers, and the plantations. And many of these enslavers wrote about how ungrateful their former slaves were. And it's interesting because this shows you how perverted the system was. You don't owe gratitude to someone who owes you an obligation to do something for you, right? If I keep my daughters fed, clothed, and housed, they don't owe me gratitude for it because it's my obligation as their father to do that for them. Now, if I go above and beyond, sure, someone can be grateful for that. But in reality, gratitude only works, in my opinion, when people are equals. When someone doesn't have to do something for you and they do it, you can be grateful for that, right? And again, this is just my opinion. In the system of slavery, enslavers were required by law in all of the slaveholding states to provide food, clothing, shelter, and medical care to the enslaved peoples, right? And at the end of slavery, they were so ungrateful for all that we did for them, right? You were required to, because they couldn't do this for themselves as enslaved people. They couldn't go travel freely and find work and provide for themselves. They were 100% subjected to the authority of the enslaver. So there was no gratitude to be given from the former enslaved or from the enslaved during the system to the enslaver, because any benefit, any things that the enslaver or his minions did for the enslaved was their required obligation to the enslaved. And one does not owe gratitude for doing what you're supposed to do. So the idea of the benevolent master, oh, we fed, we clothed them, they worked, they had everything they needed because they were supposed to, right? That was required. And if you did neglect, or if you refused to give enslaved people food, clothing, and shelter, you could fall under issues with the law and have slaves taken and sold from you and given to other people. So it just shows you this idea of gratitude is nonsense. It's meaningless. There was no such thing as the benevolent slave owner, because even the slaveholder who believed that they should do good things for their African slaves was doing it because they believed that Africans were uncivilized or barbarians, and they were bested. Their condition was bettered in the system of slavery rather than being back in Africa and being free. So even the benevolent slave owner, if you can find one who truly was benevolent, was motivated by white supremacy and racism because it was his duty to improve Africans. So again, quick video today just to dip my toe in the water of explaining why there's no such thing as a benevolent master. I will be doing a longer video on this. I appreciate your support. Remember to like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you for the next video.